Okay, so let's take a look a little bit closer at the track record of nonviolence. So looking at the trend of 628 nonviolent and violent campaigns between 1900 and 2019, there has been a steady increase in nonviolent campaigns over time, outpacing the frequency of violent campaigns. You can see here that the striped bar is the nonviolent campaigns, and the solid bar is the violent campaigns. In another study done by Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stefan of 323 resistance movements, both violent and nonviolent, between 1900 and 2006, they found that the success rate of violent campaigns decreased while the success rate of nonviolent campaigns has increased. And in this time period between 2000 to 2006, nonviolent campaigns far outperformed, violent ones in terms of success. So, which demonstrates how nonviolence can be a more logical choice as well as a more principled choice. I wanted to go into a few more examples from the main findings of their book, Why Civil Resistance Works, The Strategic Logic of Nonviolent Conflict. By the way, this is also a very interesting read. I would recommend it. They have many different case studies that they look at. So their main reasons for why nonviolent campaigns tend to be more successful compared to violent campaigns in achieving their goals. First is what they call a participation advantage. Nonviolent campaigns tend to be able to draw from a much larger and varied population of people on average. Those nonviolent campaigns that do fail or have failed over this time period that they looked at were not able to achieve this broad-based and widespread support. So why is there this participation advantage for nonviolent campaigns? First, the physical barriers are much lower. Of course, there are still physical risks for nonviolent campaigns, especially if the government or the prevailing powers are very willing to respond to resistance with violence themselves. But with a violent campaign, there's usually a certain amount of physical fitness required in order to be, a military fighter, right? There's military style training involved. And even if someone does not like or hates the current reality or does not like the government or feels it's unfair, not everyone is willing to put themselves in a situation where there's a higher risk of dying. People have died in protests, yes, but the death rate is much higher, or the risk of death is much higher in a violent campaign. And then also women and the elderly can participate much easier in nonviolent campaigns. So, of course, women do participate in guerrilla warfare and insurgencies, though at much lower rates compared to men. There are also informational barriers, which are comparatively lower for nonviolent movements. It's marginally easier to get the word out or to recruit people for a nonviolent campaign. Violent campaigns tend to need to stay much more underground and secretive. Also, when other people are observing a mass demonstration or a march or a rally amongst their friends and neighbors and colleagues, the perception of the risk decreases and they may more likely join the next time. The moral barriers for nonviolent resistance is also lower. Again, even if someone dislikes the regime or dislikes the current reality or dislikes the occupation of a foreign power, that doesn't necessarily mean they're willing to take the risk to want to end somebody else's life, right? They may even be sympathetic to a resistance group, but they might not be willing to resort to violence themselves. But with nonviolent activities and resistance, there's much lower moral challenge. And nonviolent resistance also means that people can participate even if they have varying degrees of commitment or risk tolerance. In a very large group of people, there are going to be those who are more committed to the cause and those who are just peripherally committed. Maybe they're there because their friends are there and all kinds of different commitments. But that really doesn't matter because in a nonviolence campaign, the more people, the better. People can join whether they're willing to take on more risk or less risk, right? But with a violent campaign, you really have to be committed. There's definitely a stronger vetting process for a violent campaign because you can't have people in your guerrilla army if they're not committed to having your back, right? In a fight. So there's also cases where there insurgencies or resistance, violent resistance movement will use hazing in order to ensure a stronger group solidarity. That's much less likely in nonviolent campaigns. So all these things, all these points mean that there's a much larger chance for a greater number of people to be drawn into a nonviolent campaign. This also means that they are able to attract a much more diverse participation in terms of gender, age, religion, ethnicity, ideology, profession, or socioeconomic status. The most successful campaigns are those that have mobilized a diverse group of people, representing multiple sectors of society. Campaigns that have failed are unable to do that, or groups split apart when they cannot reconcile their various differences for a common cause. And a key component in all of this is actually whether this broad base of support can also influence the military or police force. It's not that it's not a hard and fast rule, but it does help if the military or the police force are able to, or even lower ranking civil servants who are just below the top leadership, if those people are converted into supporting the resistance movement. And they're much more likely to do that because maybe they have friends, family, neighbors, colleagues who are participating in that nonviolence resistance. With violence campaigns, however, the military is much more likely to close ranks and see guerrilla fighters as a threat and be more willing to fight against them. They're less willing to fight against their own citizens. In cases where the government has used the military or the police to violently repress nonviolent movements, because that does happen. In fact, in Chenoweth and Steffen's study, they found that 88% of nonviolent movements that they studied, 88% received some kind of violent response from the government. But often that can create a backlash and it generates sympathy for the movement, even from international observers. Excuse me, I have an alarm here. Okay. And those international observers can put pressure on that government to make a change and to negotiate with the leaders of the opposition. It's easier to justify a crackdown if the adversary is using violence, less so when it's innocent civilians. Actually, when regimes crack down violently, Chenoweth and Steffen found that this increases the probability of success of the nonviolent campaign by 22%. So let us look at a case study. This is the Philippine People Power Movement from 1983 to 1986. Many of you are likely familiar with this case. Perhaps this is your home country. Perhaps you're more familiar than I am, but we'll just do a simple review. So this movement was successfully able to remove the dictator Ferdinand Marcos. Marcos was elected in 1965 in a post-colonial, post-independence Philippines. He was backed by the United States, and he was very successfully able to consolidate his power. He centralized state institutions, he restructured the military, he implemented cronyism, he created a loyal security force through promotions, salary raises, and other perks. Basically, this force, which was loyal to him, had broad power and autonomy. He was also able to gain a lot of wealth through centralization, state monopolies, external aid, and loans from international financial institutions. In 1972, when it was clear that there were some significant moves in the government, which would likely lead to Marcos and his wife losing power, he and his officials organized fake attacks against officials, and he declared martial law. He kind of used those attacks as a justification to declare martial law. This moved him more firmly into the role of dictator. There were some armed insurgencies challenging Marcos, operating in the north and in the south, and their influence expanded after he declared martial law, and he used the existence of these insurgencies as an excuse to tighten his power. Scholars say that more likely martial law was declared to prevent a presidential election in which Marcos would likely have been replaced by, excuse my pronunciation, I'm going to try this, Benigno Aquino, and facilitate Marcos's concentration of wealth. So after declaring martial law, the Supreme Court, the legislature, the Constitutional Commission, and important media outlets were suspended. Soldiers were deployed to arrest activists who were opposing martial law, and the soldiers were deployed to prevent demonstrations, and many activists and opposition leaders were arrested. So a critical turning point came from the Catholic Church. The church was the last remaining national institution that maintained independence and legitimacy during Marcos's rule. So at the beginning, when martial law was enacted, the church had a stance of collaboration, but it gradually became a channel for political opposition, especially Archbishop Cardinal Jaime Sin. He became a outspoken against martial law and Marcos's human rights abuses. He also clearly and succinctly rejected the use of violence to challenge Marcos. This was an important that he made this distinction with those and the separation with those violent groups which were operating at the same time. So grassroots organizations and the Catholic Church, they began to focus on mobilizing marginalized groups and creating a network of workers, peasants, women, students, and the urban poor, and trying to address their concerns. So some important turning points, which further exacerbated people's frustration and their willingness to mobilize against Marcos. It's a very simplified, condensed version. But basically, under the pressure of the Carter administration in the United States, which was very concerned about human rights, Marcos agreed to hold an election in 1978, but basically this election was considered a fraud with a lot of vote stealing, and intimidation. Protests broke out, protesters were arrested, and things finally turned a little bit more positive and negative. But the Philippines experienced an economic crisis in the 1980s after the 1979 oil shock. And the IMF also withheld important credits. And at this point, the business community in the Philippines began to be more aggressively anti-Marcos. Finally, in 1981, Marcos announced plans to normalize, and he lifted martial law. Arrests and open repression decreased, but extrajudicial killings increased. strikes were banned, and Marcos basically continued to rule by presidential decree, clearly indicating he did not want to give up power, but was merely trying to appease some of the unrest and hoping it will die down. And then finally, in 1983, key opposition leader Benigno Aquino, he returned from his exile in the U.S. And moments after he returned, he was assassinated by his military escort. This sparked outrage internationally and within the country. Over 2 million people showed up for his funeral, which eventually became an 11-hour demonstration against Marcos. The assassination also helped to mobilize more moderates in the middle and also the business class and in the Catholic Church to actively resist the status quo. This assassination, those people who were kind of on the fence started being more mobilized to support the resistance, the nonviolent campaign. So between October 1983 and February 1985, there were 165 rallies, marches, and other demonstrations. Some of the key final moments, the Marcos regime, in response to these protests, increased the level of repression. Security forces fired on Manila demonstrators in September 1983. 11 activists were killed at that time. Dozens were injured. By mid-1984, the regime's security forces were using truncheons, tear gas, bullets to break up demonstrations. And the increasingly mainstream participation in protest activities made the periodic state crackdowns more shocking, because these are regular people in the demonstrations, and the government is responding violently. So more and more people internationally and also locally are shocked and outraged and joining in the protests. So the civil resistance also began to draw support from independent labor parties, peasants' organizations, student and teacher associations, women's groups, human rights groups, and groups of the urban poor. Just widespread support from many different sectors of society. And other examples, there was transportation strikes, which crippled the public and private transportation in both rural and public areas. The participation for religious groups also increased. Catholic Church and also Cory Aquino, Benigno's wife, they strongly urged disciplined nonviolence. It was very important that those leaders on the top were very strongly in favor and supporting and promoting nonviolence. So as more and more the U.S. was withdrawing its support from the Marcos regime, in 1986, he suddenly called for an election, perhaps thinking that it would divide his opposition as it did in the past. This is kind of a tactic. But importantly, again, in that period leading up to the election, the church, especially Archbishop Sin and also Cory Aquino, they preached nonviolence. So as could be expected, and as previous examples would show, this election had widespread fraud, and protests broke out immediately. And those groups that were pro-Marcos declared Marcos the winner, and the opposition declared Cory Aquino the winner. Then finally, final moments of Marcos's rule came when there was a military mutiny. Two key ministers in the military declared support for the rebellion. They initially planned an attack on the presidential palace. The plan was discovered, and those mutinying soldiers, they barricaded themselves into two military camps. The two military leaders, the defense minister and the deputy chief of staff, they called a press conference, and they declared a Cory Aquino, as the rightful president because of the election fraud. And in response to Cardinal Sin's plea for support, tens of thousands of ordinary people, ordinary citizens, gathered outside those military camps where the mutinying soldiers were bunkered. And they brought them food, and they kind of created a protective barrier around the military camp, like a human barricade. Over three days, thousands of women, men, children filled the streets of the city, surrounded the defense ministry to support those military defectors. Even though Marcos sent Marines and tanks to attack the camps where those soldiers were staying, they were blocked by the protesters, by the citizens. This led to this kind of created a snowball effect where there was a nationwide mutiny of soldiers. Mutineers refused to carry out orders to attack the base since it would lead to numerous civilians casualties. The civilians would respond not with fear or with aggression, but they would sit down in front of the tanks. They would greet the pro-Marcos soldiers with flowers, with chocolates, with prayers, and calling them to defect and join the opposition. Another incident, for example, opposition forces took over a state-controlled radio station. The military were sent in to attack, but then similarly, citizens surrounded the station, greeting the soldiers, giving them food and drinks, and the troops withdrew without attacking. So then without that state-controlled radio station, and without the US government support, and with his troops defecting in larger numbers, Marcos had lost his final grip of power. He was forced to flee. The US helped him to leave the country, and there was a mostly peaceful transition of power to the new president. One commentator wrote here at the bottom, you can see the quote, "After violent revolutions, there are always scores to settle, grudges to satisfy, revenge to extract. And the cycle of violence continues. But because the Filipino people created major political change, largely without violence, national reconciliation was that much easier." So key to this success was that the campaign was able to attract many different people to support. And it was able to separate itself from the radical label of the violent groups, which were operating at the same time period. The regime labeled dissidents as communists, but once more and more ordinary people, regular citizens, were joining the campaigns and the protests and the demonstrations, that accusation lost credibility. The campaign was also able to create loyalty shifts in the military and the security forces, which would not happen if it did not have such widespread support among so many different people, even including the movement was able to sway the support of moderates. And from the highest level of opposition leadership, including the defecting generals, those leaders demanded nonviolent discipline. Mass protests almost never deteriorated into looting or rioting, which can happen in large-scale protests. But and also in the a final point is that regime suppression backfired, leading to even more mobilization and sympathy and support, even from the outside. The support of the US decreased as the regime suppression increased. So, second, amongst the major reasons why nonviolent campaigns tend to be more successful is that nonviolent campaigns are more likely to lead to democracy and less likely to devolve into civil war. So in the data that Chenoweth and Stefan looked at of 218 violent campaigns between 1900 and 2006, only 5% of successful campaigns led to democratic transitions. The probability that a country will be a democracy 5 years after a campaign ends is 50%, 57% among successful nonviolent campaigns, but less than 6% for successful violent campaigns. Even if a violent campaign has a supposed goal of bringing peace and security, the data doesn't support that reality very strongly. Countries with a violent campaign have a 42% chance of experiencing a civil war within 10 years, and that is 28% chance amongst nonviolent campaigns. So after a nonviolent campaign, the country is less likely to devolve into a civil war 10 years after the campaign. As we mentioned in the Philippines case, strict adherence to nonviolent discipline is critical. When nonviolent campaigns coexist with violent ones, as they often do, it increases the likelihood of future conflict. Sometimes even nonviolent groups will have a violent arm, which can add spoilers to the conflict. But when the nonviolent and violent campaigns coexist and are mutually supporting each other, those groups had a 49% chance of experiencing a civil war within 10 years, and that is only 27% when a nonviolent campaign did not have a violent arm or work together with an armed group. There are these are just some general trends. There are some outliers. One example, even after a massive nonviolent campaign, which removed the Shah of Iran in the late 1970s, it was succeeded by a violent and repressive regime less than a year later. But generally, the success of violent campaigns is not conducive to conditions needed for democracy and rule of law. Even if violent campaigns are successful, there's also a period when the new ruling party feels the need to assert its authority, squash dissent, and remove supporters of the former regime. So a culture of winner takes all gives the expectation that only violence works, and negotiation and compromise are ineffective, and this could more easily lead to future violence. So Chenoweth and Stefan, they cite 3 important reasons why democracy and civil peace are more likely after a nonviolent campaign. And first is that active involvement of a large and diverse group of citizens increases the chances that the population will also be politically engaged after the transition. When nonviolence is effective in removing power, even power that seemed impossible to remove, they are showing that nonviolence is effective in making change. So it's proving that we don't need to resort to violence. And this success also increases people's expectations that the new power dynamics will be nonviolent in relating to its citizens. And third, violent campaigns rely on secrecy and military values, which can carry over into the new regime. So this leaves little room for negotiations or open discussions or peacefully sharing power. Whereas on the other hand, nonviolent campaigns are more likely to rely on consent, and they rely on people's voluntary participation from diverse groups. So these aspects are very conducive to democracy and respecting the rule of law. And despite all the positives in favor of nonviolent resistance, there is a general decline in their success rate in recent years. You can see from this chart, the dotted line are violent campaigns during this period. and nonviolent campaigns also during the same period. Both have experienced a decrease in success rates in recent years. And Chenoweth, in this article that is citing this graph, gives a few reasons or speculation why this might be. Movements may be facing more entrenched regimes which are resistant to change. Governments themselves may be learning how to respond to nonviolent campaigns or nonviolent challenges in their own interests. Chenoweth actually contends that the U.S. has not recently been taking its global role in with a pro-democracy agenda that it has in the past, just like, for example, with our Marcos and Philippines example, the pressure from Carter and then later Reagan was instrumental in adding to the success of the campaign to remove Marcos. There are also some changes within movements themselves. Civil resistance campaigns have been smaller in recent years on average. It's very difficult to make a big social change if you're not mobilizing a large enough portion of the population. There's also a heavy reliance, Chenoweth contends, on mass demonstrations rather than other methods such as strikes or sit-ins or boycotts. Marches and protests might be very easy and simple to organize, especially because of social media, but it might be harder to develop shared goals or a strategic focus if there's too much reliance on mass demonstrations only. Nonviolent movements are also increasingly embracing or tolerating fringes that become violent. Those that remain strict to nonviolence and even training their participants in nonviolent tactics and mindset and way of approaching their activities, they tend to be more successful. Chenoweth has found that from the 1970s until 2010, the share of nonviolent movements with violent flanks was between 30 to 35%, but in the time period from 2010 and to 2019, that number was more than half. So more than half of nonviolent movements are tolerating or embracing violent fringes. And she says that this is a detriment to the success of nonviolent resistance. I would add to this list that it seems to be that there's not an international level leader who is advocating for nonviolence as a way of life, such as a Gandhi or Mandela or Dr. King. And as they have inspired so many from their example, we don't see that kind of leadership these days. Even though approaching nonviolence as a primarily strategic, it does open the way for broader participation. People don't feel like they have to be a particular religion or a spiritual in order to participate or stand up for a change or stand up for justice. But I feel that a clear moral compass is a detriment. In the case of the Philippines, the Catholic Church and Cardinal Sin, they were the moral and spiritual guidance, and they played an important part in inspiring people to not just vanquish or defeat your opponent, but also to teach, to dream about a better future. We are spiritual beings, not just external bodies living in a political reality. And it's my personal belief that the peace work of Father Moon and Mother Han and the movements that they founded and their public leadership could fill that gap. Even though they have never used the words nonviolence in their public speeches, as far as I have seen, if you have an example, please send it my way. But they have advocated for a peaceful vision, which I think is in line with this viewpoint that nonviolence is a way of life. Moving forward into the coming weeks, you'll be thinking about the conflict that you would like to analyze. And then part of that process of doing your analysis and writing your final paper is you will need to see where are there some openings for the situation to take a step towards peace. Not to resolve everything, but you will be making recommendations. You need to make practical recommendations of how this conflict could take a step towards transformation. So these are just some questions you can consider as you are doing that. Is there a nonviolent movement that could be strengthened, one that exists already in that country? Is that movement committed to nonviolence, or are they tolerating a fringe and violent arm? And is there a way to maybe implement trainings, not just the strategic advantages of nonviolence, but the principles of nonviolence? Are there any particular nonviolent strategies recommended? Is there any central organizing leadership which could be mobilized and activated and utilized to promote nonviolent action? And again, is there a parallel violent insurgency that is ongoing? And can it possibly be isolated somehow, non-violently? So with that, I conclude, and I'm looking forward to reading your assignments this week. Thank you.